Hey, good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning from any part of the world you're watching us from. My name is G, and I have Afo here with me, and I have Shifi here with me. This is going to be our first session for the new year. Happy New Year to everybody listening to us or watching this clip from any part of the world. So today we'll be going a little bit in depth into the cybersecurity right now. And, because one of the first things you need to know about security is, when you talk about the identity and access management, and this talks about the process of somebody being able to access the system, be able to do certain, actions on the system. And at the end of the day, we have to look at the person. Is this person actually authorized? Because in security, anybody can do anything. But the only thing we're looking at most times is an authorized person to do or users to carry out a particular action. So when that person is not authorized, then we regard it as an unauthorized person. At that point, we're looking at a breach or an invasion at that point. So in this concept, we'll be talking about the access management, identity and access management. You should be able to identify a user. A user should be identified first. So in that identification part, we talk about, providing the right credentials, then accessing the system. Then when you access the system, what can you do when you access the system? And even when you access the system, are you able to perform different actions? So we should be able to track, we should be able to monitor who does what at what time. And that is where we're going to be talking about all this in this presentation we'll be having for you guys today. And right now, this is just going to be like an introduction to this. Just bear in mind, the only thing we're talking about today is going to be identity and access management. And from here, I will give it to Afo to really, give us the scope of this, and then we'll take it from there. Afo, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, G. Good afternoon, good morning from anywhere you join us from the world. You'll be watching this from the world. And also, just to reiterate what G said, today is about talking about the new perimeter in technology right now. Most experts have been saying that identity and access management is the new perimeter because for every application or for everything that you're building right now, the first point of your user is to identify themselves, for them to get access into your systems. And I'll just be running through what identity and access management is, and also talk about the scope of what we'll be talking about today as well. Let me do this real quick. And just want to share like the scope of what we'll be talking about today is just to right now I'm just going to talk about what is it, and then I'm going to pass it on to Shifi to go ahead with that. And so identity and access management, just like what G said, is more, like I said, is the new parameter to applications to anything right now. And it consists of two pieces, which is like the identity piece is where you try to identify a user or identify an entity. In this case, the entity could be a user, it could be a machine, it could be a group of people, but the ability to be able to identify yourself. And I'll use a typical analogy where if you go to a hotel, if you have a room in the hotel, you have to, they ask you for your identification, your ID, to now for them to verify if you're actually the person that actually booked the hotel room. So that's the piece of the identification part of identity. And also, once you provide your ID, they tend to verify within their systems with your booking time the information that you've provided earlier. And for the authentication, for the authorization piece is where you're giving an access card afterwards, where you can only go to the room which you have booked, which is the authorization. You are only allowed to go to that room that you have paid for, and your access key won't be able to go into any other person's room except for any shared area that privacy is not considered, probably like their restaurant and everything. So that's the piece of what identity is, and it is crucial to any application that we build, even within our daily life. For instance, if for our phones, especially for our phones as well, when you have your phone, most of us tend to have like passcode or fingerprint as well. That is you trying to, identify yourself with a particular um, identity verification process where you swipe, either you put in your number or you put in your fingerprint before you get access to your phone. And some people who actually within their phone, I used to do this before, where even on my WhatsApp I have to even lock it an extra layer. So peradventure, if any of my children get access or they're able to get my fingerprint, they're not able to access my private messages as well. That's another layer of putting access control within your phone. And also for like mobile banking application, every individual has their mobile app. No matter how you tend to trust somebody, you won't trust them enough to give them access to your mobile banking app. So with identity and verification, you're looking at trust. And there's this concept that I would say that trust but verify. Even if you trust, so the user, you still want to like put some verification piece in place to actually make sure that this is who they say they are. So right at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Chifi to talk more about the next point of the agenda today.
All right. Thanks, Afo. And Happy New Year once again to everyone. So let me just make a quick, mention as to why do we need identity and access management. Like we earlier said, right, it's important to identify, your resources. It could be users, it could be devices, it could be machines, it could be service accounts. The first point of identification needs to happen, right? So, there has to be a point where you gather all an information collection period, whether it's the account creation, the account identification has to happen first, right? It's at the point when the identification is at the point when the identification has happened, right? Then you can now decide, okay, how do I, authenticate these users or resources, whatever the case may be. It's also important to know that, why this is very important is that, the depending on the kind of identity that is provided, right, would also ultimately determine the kind of access that someone is being given. Like for a system administrator now, right, if someone tells me this is the account they are presenting, there is no way for me to, I can't manually go into the system and say, oh, is it really this person that's sitting in front of the machine, right? But once you provide me the identity, that's typically going to be with, in most instances, a username password, right? You are assuming that identity of that entity on the machine. So once you provide this combination of a username and a password, I automatically ascribe that identity to you. A case in points would be, let's say for a bank user now, right? If you have a banking app that you log into, most likely the portal that a user or a customer would log into, right, will be different from the portal that an administrator or a bank staff, a teller, for instance, will log into, right? If I present the same credentials I'm using to log in into the administrative end, if I present that detail to the front end, right, there is every probability that, I won't get admitted, even though it's the same system I'm trying to log into, right? I'm a teller, I'm a bank teller. I have access to the same application, but typically most likely at the back end, right? But now I'm trying to use that same credential to log into the system as a customer. That identity will be rejected. I might have a different identity, right, on the system as a customer now. So now I'm trying to log into the system as a customer of the bank, trying to access my accounts, right? The presentation I would get is going to be different to when I log into the system at the back end using my, administrative credentials where I can, verify, have access to other people's accounts at the back end, be able to move money based on their instructions of what the instruments that present to me. So even within a system, right, you could have multiple identities, right? So it's important to, it's very important that we can tie an identity to a user, right? And even that identity would have, a scope in which it's relevant or is which it's valid. All right. So essentially, that is why we need to have, identity and access management. There are many components which we'll get into pretty soon of identity and access management. But ultimately, why we need it is that we need it first of all to identify people, identify resources, identify users, identify accounts, right? Beyond identification, we need to authenticate people, right? So taking us to the next point of the next component of identity and access management, which is the authentication, where you are authenticating people. That, okay, you've presented this ID. Okay, yes, I believe you are this ID, but I'm going to challenge you with an authentication, either be it a password, be it a biometric authentication, be it a token, something that lets me be able to ascribe this identity to you, right? You won't just tell me that this is you, and I will take it as that this is you, right? You provide me, and take an instance, maybe a banking app or a portal that you want to log into. You provide an email. Typically, that's going to be your ID. And then subsequently, you are challenged to provide a password as well. So the combination of that ID and that authentication challenge, right, is what makes the system ascribe that identity to you as you're logging in, right? The next component is authorization, which is where you talk about, okay, now that you've logged in, right? What are you authorized to do? That's just a brief mention of that. So authorization is what are you authorized to do once you are logged in. And then the next component is what accountability, what are you accountable for, right? What you did on the system. Every interaction with the system leave a footprint, right? So there has to be a way to be accountable for what you did. You can't say that, okay, as a bank teller, I keep making references to banking because, pretty much that's where I started my career. Uh, as a bank teller, right, you can't transfer money between accounts from one account to another, and the system will leave no trace, right? Imagine that kind of a system will be very, it's going to be very porous. Like if I can transfer money from one account to another account, maybe if I'm a malicious user, I transfer money from a customer account into my personal account from the back end, right? And there is no way that activity can be traced, right? Pretty much there'll be incentive to do that bad behavior. But because there's accountability, right, people are, disincentivized from behaving like that. So those are the three areas we'll be talking about in a bit. But let me dive deeper into the authentication section, right? So authentication is pretty much being able to assume an identity, right? So you present your ID and then a password, right? The system goes back into the backend and is able to verify the password that you provided and the ID, and is able to assign that to a particular identity in its backend. That, okay, based on this combination of these two factors, I'm able to validate that this is this person that has authenticated, right? Like I said earlier, the system engineer cannot come and cannot come to your system and say, oh, is this physically the person using the system? The systems are not designed like that. It's not efficient, right? But if you're able to provide me with an ID, right, and a password that matches, right, I can conveniently believe that this is this user, right? And I can present you an interface based on your user profile because you've successfully authenticated. Keep in mind that depending on the level of security that the system or what you are trying to access, the level of will I say severity or the level of value that it has, right? Authentication could go more than one step, right? Um, it could challenge you for a second factor. It could challenge you for a third factor, right? But all of this is trying to authenticate you to making sure that the person that you are saying you are is actually who you are, right? And mostly, there's another section where we'll talk about, again, where we talk about the multi-factor authentication, right? All of this still has to do with under authentication, right? Typically, when you're authenticating, we have three types. There's a type 1 authentication, which is what you know, typically a password, right? There's a type 2 authentication, which is what you have, things like maybe a token or a passkey, right? And then there's another type 3 authentication, which is what you have, which is where we come into biometric authentications, right? Typically, for something to be a multi-factor authentication, it has to be a combination of one of these two types of authentication, right? It makes, it's not very design efficient to say you have a multi-factor authentication and then you are using a password, right? And then a passphrase, right? Both of them are achieving the same thing. They are both what you know, right? You can say you're using a password and let me see another example. You're using a password and you're using a secret question, right? You're still combining the same type of authentication. So for it to be really effective, it has to be one of at least two of the three types: a password and biometric, a password and a token, right? So you have to make your authentication, and then at the same time, it doesn't make sense to over secure something that it's really not worth it, right? Somebody's trying to log into maybe let me give an example of maybe, they just try to access a web page for a bank, the front page, right? And then you're telling them to authenticate with a username, a password, a biometric, a token. The information they are protecting is not worth that amount of investment in securing it. So, you have to balance out the equation there. So that's pretty much about authentication. I think I'll pass it on to G to talk about authorization next.
Hi, thanks, Shifi. You've really you've dealt with the authentication part so much, and you said a lot about that, and which is what everybody actually knows about the authentication process, because like Afo talked about the identification as well. You have to be identified and you have to be authenticated before you can actually be authorized to do certain things on the system. And when you talk about authorization, the basic thing you just want to understand about this is just to tell you like what permissions, what can you access, what type of access permission or permissions you have to the system, or what does the system can do on anything within the system itself. Sometimes it could be user, sometimes it could be system, because the system can be granted access to another, object, because we have like a user and the object. I mean, subject and object in this context. Because anytime you talk about, identity and access management, we look at the subject and we look at the object. The object is what the subject should have access to. And, in that context, you just really need to understand, like, if a subject is in the system trying to do certain things, what are the things, how can this be done? So in authorization process, we talk about the roles and we talk about the policy. The roles can be, okay, this is the role for this person, but the policy underneath the role, what makes up the role is actually the policy, where they have to specifically using code. Sometimes they use like, it could be Python, it could be YAML or something, just to really write the code to really specify if we give this particular role to this user or to this group of users. Because anytime you talk about identity and access management, you want to talk about the group, the users, the group, because we have the user to be one person, we have the group to be multiple users. So we can actually place a particular, some users in a certain group. Like, when you talk about the bank, back in Nigeria, we have the marketing team, we have the people working in the operations, we have the, even in the operation, even in the market, we'll still have the different levels. We can have the ET, we can have the ABO, we can have to the ED and the rest. So based on the levels, that is going to determine the kind of permissions that we have to the system. So now you've been in the ABO, you're in a particular level in the marketing, you have you should be able to have access to certain objects as a user in the system, on the system. So based on that, that is what we talk about the authorization. So when you talk about the policy, under the policy is where you specify this particular thing should be done by this particular user or this subject. So now that policy is what they use to get the role. So the role is now what they will attach to that particular user or to the group of users. So once they assign it to a particular group as a users in that group, the policy, the roles attached to that particular group is what everybody in that group will actually leverage on to be able to have access. So I'll give an example. Afo talks about, having access to a hotel. The first step is they give you a card, but after giving you the card, what can you do with that card within the what's it called? The hotel or something. Sometimes you go to some companies and they tell you this particular place is restricted for staff only. So that they are trying to tell you, as much as you have access to the building, based on whatever your reason in that particular location is, but this particular area is restricted to staff only. So that is like they're telling you have an access to this, but the level you can go stops here. So same thing happens to the system. We have admin, we have what we call the role-based access control. We have, attribute access, attribute-based access control as well. So the role-based access control, which is just talking about, we are assigning this particular access to you based on your role. If this is what you have to do, then if this is your role in the organization based on your work role or subject or whatever your role is in that particular organization, they only attribute that particular access to the system to you to be able to carry out that specific role. You can do more than that. So that is what they use. So the attribute just talk about like, maybe that is like a condition or something like, okay, maybe you can actually do this or you may not be able to do this. It's kind of similar, but it's a little bit different. But the most important thing about authorization is just telling you the permissions you have to be able to carry out different functions on the system. Sometimes we have admin. We have admin that has, an admin in a particular organization has, more than enough privilege access to the system. And that takes us to another thing they call privilege access management, because privilege access management can be for users and they can be for non-interactive users, because we have like non-human accounts sometimes where we have to manage the access to the system at that point. Because, you use some non-human accounts in some, different cases. You can be talking about the API integration. We don't want to go into details on that concept right now, but just understand anytime they talk about authorization, this is only telling you what you can do within the system, the permissions you have, how that takes place, or how they're able to build up the role, start from the role and the policy. And once they build a policy, it goes to the role. From there, they attach the role to the users or the group of users, whereby you can actually do certain things on the system. I don't want to go too further because we have so many things we use to be able to determine the role. We have something they call the sale point, which is an application to be able to create users. Then you can actually manage the role. You can have access to, I can give you a read access, a write access, and execute access. So those different access or permission level depends on what I want you to do on the system. If I want to just be able to read, I will give you just the read access. If I want you to be able to execute or to write, the write and execute goes hand in hand. But if I want you to be able to execute or to be able to make some correction or something, I can actually give you the write access. If I want to be able to do more than that, then I can give you the execute access. So all this is just talking about the different things the users can do on the system based on those different things I've just talked about. So that determines the level of permission I can give to a particular user to be able to do certain, functions on this, to be able to carry out certain functions on the system and be able to do anything. So whatever is limited based on the policy they've created under the rule, that is what is going to limit your authorization level on that system. So I think Shivi has something to add to this. Shivi,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, G. So I think you mentioned one very important thing. I just wanted to add to that. And, majority of users or majority of the time, you mentioned different types of authorization management, right? How you manage authorizations. And most times, right, the ones that most users are more familiar with is the role-based, the RBAC, the role-based access control. And, you mentioned that, that's where you have like a group and then users are added into the group. And I just wanted to stress on why that is very, very important because, in the life of an, let me use a user, for instance, right? In an organization, right, a user could go through different roles in different times. It could start as a customer care, still keeping it with the banking analogy. It could start as a customer care, move to marketing. Maybe someone who is, very IT driven, get an opportunity to, get into the IT. Um, the administrator doesn't need to, manage his individual access across all of these roles as it's moving, right? Because what happens is that, you see people moving across uh, different units, and then they are getting authorization creep, meaning that, they are accumulating authorizations across. Someone was previously in IT, right? And then he leaves IT and then goes to maybe a more customer facing role like a customer care. But if there is no RBAC, for instance, even while he's in customer care, he retains all those access that he has, right? Which is why you see someone joins from IT and maybe joins the marketing department, and then he will tell you, oh, I have privilege to install applications. Oh, let me install applications. Now that even, these were access I used to have when I was previously in IT or a system administration, right? But now I'm in marketing and I've still kept those privileges, right? That's what we call authorization creep, accumulating privileges across different units. RBAC helps you manage this in such a way that, once a user is moving to a different role, right? All you need to do is that, remove that user from his current role, right? And attach him to the new role that is supposed to, now begin to use, right? It makes administration a lot easy because you don't have to individually manage, oh, this person is supposed to have access to marketing guides, is supposed to have access to all the marketing databases. Is You don't need to do all that. All you need to do is that, okay, what is the current role that it needs to have? Is now a marketer. I'm moving into a group for marketers. So everybody that's in marketing has the same rights and privileges. And then is no more in IT. I remove him from every reference that has to do with everything that has to system admin or IT roles. Okay. So RBAC, it's I think it's been there for, like I said, there are many, access control systems that we could use, right? But RBAC is, one of the ones you will get to interact with, and even in one shape or one way or form or the other, right? You must have interacted, even though you don't know that this is what it is. But that is when you move users into a group, right? And then you are giving them privileges based on the group membership. What you are doing is role-based access control. All right. Let me hand it over to G if he wants to add anything to round up before we move on to the next segment.
I mean, you've added it, like you said, there are so many things we do that we probably don't even know this is the concept behind it. And, like you talk about the authorization creep, which is one of the most important thing when you talk about the authorization. And, in a poor company that they have like, authorization management, it leads to that authorization creep, and that person can do so many things. Like you say, we still have like mandatory access control. We have the discretionary access control. We have so many different types of access control, and based on what a subject can do to the objects, which, like I said, so but then we don't want to go into so much details right now. So I will let Afo talks about the accountability of users and system. I mean, within the system, so we can move from there. All right, Afo, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, G. Thank you, Shafi. For the last piece, for the last component that we're talking about today is the accountability. Some people call it auditability as well. And there's this saying that if you build a system that user can deny any action they perform, then you cannot trust that system, which brings about the accountability piece of it. IAM is a system that kind of like grant access to users, to resources, between users and resources, or groups as well. And we should have a way to be able to go back to history of what a user has performed on a resource. So that is where accountability comes in, where as we build out IAM systems, we try to build accountability into it in such a way that if a user perform an action or they didn't perform an action, we can be able to audit their actions and say, oh, they actually do this. And it takes me to another concept within IT that we call the non-repudiation, where a user cannot deny an action they perform. And that is where accountability piece, where you go to the access logs to review user access. And I think Chibi mentioned where somebody could start as a customer service agent and then find their way through the ranks of the organization. And if you're not careful, it might actually lead to what we call the access creep or organization creep. And this is the piece where the access log review, like access review, comes in, periodic access review, because as people move within ranks within an organization, you want to make sure that they are not accumulating this excessive permission. And then eventually, if they are being compromised, if their credentials are to be compromised, that could actually increase the blast radius of if it could increase the blast radius of any incident that might actually happen to the organization. So for every system that we build, generally in IT, we always try to create accountability systems as well. And most of these are actually through logs as well. And going back to the analogy that I said earlier, like if you look at some hotel, go to some hotel, their way of accountability would be the form of like, what do they call this? These cameras. So the cameras can actually take the time where you check them into the hotel, and within their system that they've built as well, they'll be able to, so you cannot deny that you didn't check in or when you checked out, because they have some of these reporting accountability systems in place, and which is essential for any access control systems. So, and that's just the accountability piece of the components. I think G wants to add to that. Go ahead.
I mean, thanks for going over the accountability. And like you said, a lot of accountability is just, like you said, is just to really be able to get everything that happens. And, and you mentioned again, which, there's something they call the logs. So we have the logs where everything is, and you mentioned about the non-repudiation as well, which is just the ability for somebody not to be able to deny. And all these pieces are very, very important, because when something happens and somebody says, okay, I didn't do this, but then there's like a logs that can actually say you perform this action at this particular time on this system. And that is why they trace everything back to your identification. And that is why in identification, everything has to be unique. Because if I have AD has his name as AD and another person is having AD in the same company, so they have to find a way to make sure like something unique is tied to one particular AD, which makes it different from the other person. And this is, common practice in so many organizations. I remember when I was in Nigeria, we have something like, somebody gives you like his either login just to really do something on their system and everything. And that is not the real person doing it. And it comes back to when they are doing, when they use that particular ID to commit or to carry out any fraud, they come back to that person based on the logs they've reviewed. And that is where the accountability comes in. They review the log. This action was performed, by this particular ID that belongs to this particular person. And now you want to deny, oh, I didn't do it. But then they tell you, oh, you actually do this thing. You did this thing by this time on this day. Then that is what the accountability is talking about there. And that is where the logs, because anytime you talk about accountability, you have to talk about the logs. Logs are very, very important. And even in some organization, even if you have like an administrative access, they still try to make sure like you can't delete certain things, because some people have an administrative access and they go to the system, they try to delete the logs of, just to erase their traces so that they can't really trace any action they've performed to them. So in the concept of, IAM, like you said, accountability, authentication, authorization, they all work hand in hand, but just understand the concept of one leads to the other. And the last one, which is accountability, is trying to get hold of everything and be able to trace a particular action to a particular user or subject, that's everything I want to add. Shifi, if you have anything, you can add as well.
No, I think, you've pretty much captured it all. Yeah, I think that was a good coverage. Thanks. I think that will take us into the next segment where we'll talk about some few concepts. I think we've mentioned it already, but we just stressed them out a bit in more details. So I'll talk about one concept, which is the least privileged, right? And basically what this is telling us is that you should build systems, or you should plan access to systems, right, with as minimum rights as possible that someone needs to complete their job. That's the whole concept around least privilege. Right? If this is, the minimum amount of access that you need to be able to successfully perform this role, right? That is the access that the person should have. So let me give an example now. So if you have someone that's interacting with a banking application, right? Or let's even say an IT person. Let's take it back into the system administrators now, right? A system administrator for a level 1 engineer, right? It needs access to the interface of the let's call it a firewall person, right? The firewall engineer. It needs access to be able to make changes on the firewall, right? Add permissions, add users to roles, view logs on the rules. That is for that level 1 role that is taken, that's all of the access that it needs to be able to perform that role. The access that you provision for that user then shouldn't allow him to be able to do things like do a reboot of the firewall. It shouldn't allow him to do a software upgrade on the firewall, right? So if you look at this concept, right? So this is even within administrators. So there are different levels of administrators, right? So within that, even the level of administrators should have just enough rights or enough access for them to be able to perform whatever role that they require, right? Let me break it down a bit more. Taking it into a banking application where a teller that is attending to a customer, right? It needs access to just be able to maybe, move money in between accounts, right? That's the access that they should be given. They shouldn't have access to, for example, check the treasury balance of the entire bank, right? The teller doesn't need that kind of access. So there should be no reason why, a teller should be granted that access. So when we talk about least privilege, think of it in terms of the maximum amount of access that you need to be able to fulfill a role and nothing more than that. And that's, every concept ties in together, right? If you have a role-based access control, right? You've known that, okay, for this particular role of a level 1 engineer, right? All level 1 engineers needs all of these permissions. It needs access to be able to make rules. It needs access to be able to, view logs. Anybody that you add into that group of level 1 engineers, right? They will be able to do all of those activities and nothing more, right? So that's basically the concept of least privilege. I think AD wants to add something to that. AD?
Thanks, Shifi. What I just wanted to have with this privilege is this conversation we typically have at work that this privilege in itself is not as if it doesn't stop entry, it doesn't stop the bad guys from entering. But again, what it addresses is more like to reduce the blast radius of any incidents. Because, for instance, just like he has mentioned, where a level 1, a firewall engineer is just there, the role is for that person to just add or remove rules. And then you give the person over permission where they can actually even bring down the old firewall. And let's say their credentials were to be compromised. So what you're doing there is that if a bad guy should take over that account, they would have the same power, that excessive permission to bring down your entire firewall. So this privilege tends to address, because there's this thing we also say security that it's just a matter of time before you get breached. But again, you just want to make it difficult and catch it early and stop it. You want to reduce the effect of any form of attack, which is one of the things least privilege kind of like addresses. Yeah, G.
Thanks, Eddie, for that. Yeah, you know, always there's this new slogan that goes around. Always operate with the mindset of assumed breach. Assume that you have already been breached, but you just don't know about it yet. So it's almost like if you are working in IT or even in cybersecurity, you pretty much have to be, I say, a bit paranoid. Like, you always need to think a step ahead. Always assume that, the bad actors are already in the environment. So as much as possible, you want to make it, very difficult for them. If a server needs access, an application server, right, needs access to a database server, once you are creating the permissions, right, create the permission to that the application is only accessing only the database server that it needs to access, only the ports it needs to access on the server, right? So always, operate with the mindset that, I'm going to give enough permissions as possible, whether it's users or whether it's systems, enough permissions for you to do what you need to do, but nothing more. If a system is, you have systems, you have what's it called, applications on your, on user systems, right? You've pre-built the application, the system with all the application that's needed for the users, right? There is no reason to allow users to install applications on their system because the system is coming with a build, and that build contains all of the application that's needed for that system. So there is no need for you to give a privilege to users to be able to install application because, based on the build that the system that the organization is using, these users don't need any other application, right? Therefore, they don't need rights to be able to install applications on their system. All right. So, G, can you round that up for us so that we can move on to the next section? I think you are taking on the next section, which is MFA. So you can close out the least privilege and then take us into the MFA.
Thanks, guys, for giving more information and detailed information about the least privilege. And like you said, like you guys said, this is just to prevent incidents that can lead to breach. And this is just to limit the access. People have administrative access and they can do so many things. But then, because I know one time something happened where somebody has like access to do certain things and it was able to do more and that led to a fraud by using somebody's system to do, somebody's login details to carry out a particular transaction, and that led to fraud. So which is why the belief access sometimes can be given based on, your experience and your level, just to make sure, okay, you've been on this job for a very long time. You should be able to have experience about certain things and to be able to prevent fraud in some ways, which is one of they want to make sure, like, if you're as a new user or a newcomer into the organization, they try to give you the least access you have to the system to be able to do certain things. So with time, I remember when I got to my current organizations, I was given access to certain things, but with time, I was given more access to be able to carry out more functions based on level of trust. Okay, we trust this guy, we know these guys can actually handle this. And from there, they started giving me some access to be able to do certain things on the system, which comes with a discretionary access at that point, because your boss will decide to say, okay, I think this person is okay to be able to do more functions than what the least privilege he had at the beginning of his career in the organization, which is something everybody kind of like consider, and which makes least privilege one of the most important thing or important tools in identity and access management. So I will go straight to MFA. Like everybody talks about MFA, what is actually about MFA, what it is, why is MFA very important? So MFA is just talking about multi-factor authentication. So the multi-factor authentication can be 2 or can be more. But sometimes it can be 2 or more. So what are those 2 or more? So we have what we call, how do we enforce multi-factor authentication in access management? We have the identification when the user is able to identify his or herself on the system by using the right username and the correct password. So we take it to the next level of, okay, we know you've provided this, but those credentials to be able to have access to the system. But we need to do additional verification before we can actually grant you access to the system. So this is where the multi-factor authentication comes in, like additional something to validate that this person is the right person to have access to the system. So what they do most times, because people mistake this thing, like you said, Shifi, earlier, like, a lot of time people say they use password and they use, secret questions or answer, and they use passphrase, or they use, a couple of things, PIN or something. They use all those things, which still falls under what we call something, So like anything, password, PIN, passphrase, questions, all those things are something. But now we have something we'll call something you have, which could be like token, it could be one-time token, it could be, dynamic token or something, which comes with, okay, this is an additional something. It could be like a software token, it could be like a hardware token. So whereby you have to like press it. So in the hardware token, there's a way they actually attach that particular token to you as a subject or as a user on the system. So that's like something for another day where we have to go in depth into identity and access management and all those things. So they give you the token whereby you just have to, after you put in your login credentials, then a token will be sent, to you, or you have to generate a token, software token, or you have to press, because most of the hardware token, you just press a button on it, it displays a number, then you have to put the number. Then we have something you have, which is like a biometric. People see biometrics to be one of the most secured, way of, accessing the, system. But because that is something that will be very difficult for you to forge. Everybody fingerprint, fingerprint is something unique to each individual. And, we have the iris scan, we have the facial scan, we have the palm, we have so many things we can use for something you have like biometrics or something, which everybody sees to be very expensive. But it all depends on how the company values security. If the company values security as one of the most important things, a lot of time they go for something, something you are. At the end of the day, security is about, even as much as you're trying to make the system secure, you also don't want to create a kind of like frustration for people, because we have type 1 and we have type 2. And that's something you have the type 1 whereby you have the right person being denied access, and you have the wrong person being granted access. So right person being denied access can be very frustrating, just because I'm using my palm or I'm using my fingerprint and it's not working. So I have the right to access the system. It can actually get frustrated at that point. But at the same time, you're trying to prevent a wrong person having access to the system at the same time. So in that case, you're trying to manage everything. As much as you're trying to put a security there, you're also trying to make sure this is not something too difficult for people. It's not creating a lot of problem for people to be able to, leverage on. So in that concept, you're using different method of authentication. You can only combine type 1 and type 2, or type 1, type 2, and type 3. But a lot of time people combine just type 1 and type 3 just to really, make the system a little bit. Some people just use one because they feel if they can use the fingerprints, which is very unique, that makes the system, that gives us this assurance, like anybody being able to use that fingerprint. But we've seen people trying to clone people's finger and try to reprint, or which is something very funny, because in security you can never stop a determined attacker. So it's just somebody who wants to attack you. They can take years to really study how the system operates, but at the end of the day, they'll still able to launch that attack. So in the old concept, combining type 1 and 2, or combining type 1 and 3, or combining type 2 and 3, or combining either of these or all of them is what makes up, multi-factor authentication. So if you're using password and you're saying I'm using PIN again, that is still something So that is not really going to stop anything. So in that concept, just understand, like, combining type 1 or type 2 and type 2, or type 1 and type 3 is what makes up the multi-factor authentication. I think if you want to add something to that.
Yes, thanks, G. I think I just wanted to add something. I think you made a very good point there when you talked about the fact that, yes, we want to, protect access, right? But at the same time, we want to avoid frustrations for the user, which is also, very important. Obviously, security is there to support the business, right? You don't want to make the system, unusable for legitimate users, which is why sometimes uh, the systems are built to also have intelligence, right? You would also notice that it's not every time that you want to access your bank details, for instance. It's not going to be every time that you get challenged for a second authentication. Let me give you an instance now. I've been logging in to my banking application, right, from my home, like for the last 6 months. It has built a profile around my access. It knows the IP address I typically come from. It knows the device that I typically use in my phone, right? On my laptop. It has like, if, it's created a profile based on those parameters that matched. Now, all of a sudden, uh, I traveled to, um, let me say, Europe, right? And then the system has that intelligence that says, oh, wait a minute, I've never seen this person log in from Europe before, right? Could this be an hacker, right? Could this be, a malicious person? Rather than me granting him the access immediately, I'm going to ask him for a second factor. So sometimes, right, the second factor, right, also becomes discretionary based on how the system is designed, right? Because you wonder sometimes, oh, why is this system asking me for this? It didn't used to ask for this before. It's all in effort to try and protect, the assets. Because if the person is peradventure able to, say a hacker is sitting somewhere in Europe now, right, and it manages to get your password, right, the organization has put in some kind of, captured some kind of parameters that they typically recognize you as, right. Once that changes, hopefully most banks are doing that now. That is helping us to protect our money. It's supposed to be intelligent enough to challenge you for a second factor. So, oh, let me send this person an OTP, right, to challenge the authentication that, oh, just because something different has happened, right? So they should, sometimes some systems are, always MFA. Some systems are, based on attributes. Once something in the attributes changes, right, that's when it challenges you for that second factor. All right. So that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah. Thanks, Shifi. So for the last concept that we'll be talking about today will be the zero trust. And again, when it comes to IAM, there are several concepts that is in IAM, but we've just kind of like curated just few of these concepts to talk about. And the last piece of them is zero trust. For zero trust, it's based on never trust anything and always verify when it comes to IAM. And in the different cybersecurity architecture, where from the networking, from identity, from storage, everything, there's this concept of zero trust that is applicable to all the layers of different phases of IT. And some of the core principles of zero trust, we've actually spoken about some of them, is what we call the assume breach principle that Shifi spoke about, where you want to design system in such a way that if an attacker should attack your system, what's the extent of damage that they can actually carry on your system. So, and that's one of the core principles behind zero trust. And the other piece that we spoke about earlier was the least privilege access as well. The least privilege says that, again, from the assume breach mentality, where you only give user the maximum permission that is needed for them to carry out their job. In the case of the firewall engineering that we spoke, all he needs to do is just to change rules. Then you don't have to give them more permissions to change, to actually rename the firewall, or add more functionality to it. You just want to give them the minimal permission that they require. And the other piece is also to verify. The another principle is to verify explicitly, and it goes back to what Shifi spoke last night. If you were to log into your banking app from United States all the time, and then for the past 6 months, a profile has been built up for you. You would have been given like an identity profile that when you now move to Europe or you move to China, and then you try to log in from the same device, but from a different location, it's going to ask you more because at that point, the system does not trust if you are who you say you are. And then that will lead to more authentication processes where, we'll send something to your email, give us the PIN, then it leads to a multi-factor authentication where you sign it with your password, then they've sent you something you have, which is another factor for you to calculate, for you to kind of like, prove that you are who you say you are. And those are some of the like core principles. The other principle is to make sure you build defense in depth into your IAM systems in the sense that for every layer of identity, you want to like put security controls in place in all the different layers. You don't want to have a good authentication process and then you have a bad authorization process. You want to make sure that the same amount of security you invest in authentication, you put in authorization. And one common, especially for OWASP top 10, OWASP top 10, and these are like the top 10 vulnerability within web application. One of the most common one that has always come up, even in the 2025 release, is the broken access control. And broken access actually be like most bridges is always from like where somebody's credential is being, compromised, and then, they get access to your system. And even apart from that, for legitimate users, you'll see in organizations that for legitimate users, they can actually escalate their privilege within a system. So this is on the access part of things, like I said, identity and access management. The identity, which focuses on authentication, and the access, which is the authorization, is a very crucial piece of is very crucial to the system. For me, some of the testing that I've done in the past when it comes to web application testing is to test for broken access control, because a legitimate user, a standard user, can actually escalate their privilege to perform a main function. When they're authenticating, they're authenticated as a regular user. But again, because they are able to maneuver the system, they can actually, escalate their privilege. So the whole point of the zero trust concept is to make sure that you verify explicitly without trusting. And another example that I will give is there are some organizations where if you want to connect to their network, there are some rules that needs to be evaluated from your computer. You have to have like the latest operating system that they've created as a baseline for the organization. You have to have the latest antivirus. You have to be connected from the company's VPN. You have to turn on the VPN before you can connect. So these are some of the ways that the system does explicit check to verify, okay, you are the person that you say you are before accessing your systems. So I don't know if anyone wants to add to what I've said.
Yeah, I think you pretty much captured it all very well. Thanks, for. Yeah, security is always evolving, right? That's one thing you need to know. There used to be a time where the slogan was, the slogan in security then was, what do you call it? Trust but verify, right? I think we've gone beyond that now. It's now zero trust. Zero trust, assume breach. Like, don't trust anything. You can't, you pretty much, that's the mindset you have to operate on, right? If you want to have a secured infrastructure, because pretty much, believe it or not, there are people whose, livelihood depends on breaking into your system. Like, the malicious actors have nothing to do all day than to find ways to breach your system, right? So as much as possible, right? If you think spending money on security is, too much, right? Uh, Imagine, right, the amount of money you would have to spend, or the amount of money you would lose if there is a breach, reputational damage, right? Some of the losses are even unquantifiable, right? Because when you start to look at, the concept of, defending against identity thefts or identity breaches, right? Or broken access controls, like you mentioned it, right? defending against them, typically always requires multiple layers. Just like you said, I feel like, you have to build your system with a defense in-depth mindset. A web application, in front of the web application, you have the, the maybe a WAF in front of the web application. The WAF is ultimately helping you filter malicious or known bad IP addresses, SQL injections and all of that. Behind the WAF, right, you have a firewall, right, which is also doing, the its own L3 or layer 3 or application level filtering for you, right? On the application itself, right, you also have some level of security that you've implemented built into the application. So across all the layers, right, you're building security across all of them, right? So that's pretty much how security has, evolved, and that's how much, we have to invest in security of, our prized assets as it is today. So to summarize, identity and access management, just like we said, right? It's the backbone of all access control or access rights that you could give to a system, right? Ultimately, if you are building a system, um, you can't build a system in isolation. You are building a system for it to be accessed by something or by someone eventually, right? So you have to make sure that you are um, protecting the access around that system or that entity or that portal, whatever the case may be. So identity access management, you have to first of all identify what what you are protecting or what asset is, and then even the people or the services, just like G said, the subject and object, everything needs to be identified. Then you can now talk about the authentication and then the authorization that needs to happen around those systems. What can access what? A system that's a subject today could be an object tomorrow. So all of those things need to matter. So, but the key thing is that try as much as possible to identify all your systems, all your users, all your service accounts. Once there's once the identity is established, then all of its authorization, authentication can always build on that. Let me add it over to G to also add something instead.
No, thanks guys for for all you said about this, and like you guys said, this is still gonna be like a beginning of identity and access management. And we still have a lot to talk about here. And about the concept of identity and access management, the tools, the technology, we have the decentralized identity. Access control, we have the single sign-on, we have the federated identity. So we have so many concepts that we've not really talked about, but then this is just gonna be the beginning, and we'll still come back, talk again about this. Identity and access management, because this is a very broad topic in security. So like, we just want you guys to know one thing. Access is not just to the system, because if we go to some companies, access starts from the perimeter of the company itself. So not just, being able to have access to the system. It starts from because that's why when we talk about security, we talk about the defense in depth. So if you prevent somebody from coming into the company, you've been able to do something there. Because only when the person gets into the company, the person can actually, have access to the system. So some perimeter might be logical perimeter, not physical, in terms of building your infrastructure in the cloud or on the system or something. So like my company has this, your company has this. How there is a perimeter which is like, something really containing everything we do within the company. And that is why we have the intranet and we have the internet. So access is not just to system alone. It starts from, that's why we talk about security. When they talk about the security guard in front of the company, checking people in, when they tell you this is under cybersecurity, then you'll be wondering, how did that happen or something, which is part of, physical security. Security, cybersecurity, identity and access management is not limited to your computer. It's not limited to what you can do online. It's not limited to how we see it, but it goes beyond. And we'll still kind of like create other time to really talk about this, and we'll be able to go in depth to our next thing to really talk about some tools and some security services and identity as a service as well. So we'll take it from there. So let me give Afo to kind of like, give us the closing remarks for today. Eddie.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shifi. Thank you, G. And for everyone watching this, thank you so much. Just like they've all said, IAM is not an option when it comes to IT. It's a necessity. It's the new perimeter to everything from physical access to digital access. IAM is part of our everyday, and we'll do some deeper dive into some of IAM tools and how to create some of this in later episodes as well. At this point, I think we have come to the end of the session for today. Thanks as you watch.
All right. Thank you and have a good day. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good one. Bye.
All right.